Anthony Caravaggi of the University of South Wales, talking to us about wetland birds of the Severn Estuary. After Anthony's finished, that's when we'll have questions for both speakers. So over to you, Anthony.
Thank you kindly. So yes, as was just introduced, I will be talking about spatial variation in wetland bird abundance and assemblage on the Severn Estuary. I should point out that this work was undertaken by a master's student who was working with me, Jessica Stone. Jess was supposed to be presenting today, but unfortunately wasn't able to make it, so I'm presenting in her stead. So all the credit for this work, and she's done some excellent work, should be Jess's. I'm merely a mouthpiece. I'm a lecturer in conservation biology at University of South Wales, where Jess was studying. The study was also partially supervised by Richard Facey of Natural Resources Wales. So, to begin, wetland birds are broadly in decline, okay, in the UK. The number of wetland birds has declined by roughly 17% or so since 1975. Now, that's not breaking them down into groups of wetland birds, so seabirds, waders, etc. Okay, this population decline affects nutrient cycles and community assemblages. It's associated largely with habitat fragmentation, changes of habitat use, etc. And we've actually lost 90% of our wetland habitat across the UK over the last century or so. And this habitat has many important functions. So a good example is frequently much is made of the UK's flood defences, but wetlands are also important for water quality. They're highly biodiverse habitats with unique and very area-specific species. And the loss of habitat obviously influences the loss of birds, but the loss of birds also feeds back towards the habitat. It negatively impacts the remaining wetlands. Hence, the birds and the habitat need successful conservation management if they're going to persist going forwards. So the Severn Estuary SPA, or Special Protection Area, is an SPA designated for its wetland bird assemblages. It's also listed as a Ramsar site for its internationally important wetland sites, which comprise exposed mudflats, salt marshes, wet grasslands, and it supports over 80,000 wintering waders and wildfowl. Now, there are no broad scale and detailed studies into the distribution of wetland birds along the estuary. And as such, it's difficult to evaluate conservation management needs and appropriate site-specific management of the SPA as a whole, given the broad variance in bird abundance and site distribution and type. Understanding where birds are and where they can be found in high abundance can allow underlying patterns to be identified and determined. For example, shared habitat features in sites that support high abundance of wetland birds. We can also look at the distribution of individual species of conservation concern, as this informs conservation by identifying what does and does not work, and then we can use these inferred guidelines to guide decision making, effectively informing evidence-based conservation to increase numbers across the entire SPA. Okay, so obviously I mentioned there's species of conservation concern, and in this presentation I'll not only be talking about wetland birds generally, but I'll also put a focus on the featured species of the SPA, i.e. redshank, gadwall, dunlin, European white-fronted goose, Bewick swan, and shelduck. And in terms of focal questions, what Jess was really asking was how wetland birds assemblages and abundance change across the Severn Estuary, and how does environmental variation affect wetland bird abundance on the Severn Estuary? So wetland birds are sensitive to a number of changes between sites. Um, Habitat diversity indices can be used to compare numbers of microhabitats between sites with wetland bird abundance and diversity. Um, and such studies often show a positive association with habitat diversity. There is, in fact, a species area relationship between wetland bird area and bird abundance. Estuaries are often largely comprised of intertidal mudflats, and a decrease of mudflat area leads to a decrease in overwintering survival rates. This can be seen in the Humber Estuary. Then we also have to consider anthropogenic factors. So, for example, a lack of connectivity of wetland sites in fragmented landscapes can decrease wetland bird abundance and lower the diversity of isolated, even if ostensibly good quality wetland sites. And you can see we have a slide here on spatial variation. We have all of these contexts in the Severn Estuary. We have areas of considerable anthropogenic activity. We have extensive mudflats, and we have managed sites with lots of small microhabitats, which may ostensibly be favorable for wetland birds. So the study site, obviously the Severn Estuary, but there were 24, I believe. 24 sites across the study site where Jess obtained data from the British Trust for Ornithology, specifically their wetland bird survey data. In the wetland bird survey method, volunteers use a kind of look and see methodology. A route is chosen where all of the site is viewed. Every wetland species that is seen is recorded. Obviously, you don't record what you don't.
Hi, Anthony, you're going to have to turn your camera back on. We seem to have lost you.
Anthony, if you can hear us, we've lost your audio and your video at the moment.
Hi, apologies. I am having network issues. Doesn't throw me off at all. So in the wetland bird method, volunteers visit sites, record the presence and abundance of every wetland bird species that they see. In the current study, basically to maximize the potential analysis over time, Jess selected sites that were visited an average of 6 times a year or more across data from 1999 to 2018. So we're not looking across the total span of time that webs have been undertaken, nor every individual site. We're looking at a subset of sites, and this work will inform further work down the line. So the first thing we did was to explore spatial variation in abundance. We used a very simple kernel density estimation method to explore these kind of spatial changes in presence and abundance. And what we see is an uneven distribution of wetland birds along the estuary. And it's worth bearing in mind here that these are all records from 1999 to 2018. We'll come on to a little bit of spatial variation in a moment. And what we see within these data are particularly high densities of abundances around the kind of Cardiff Newport area here and across on the Somerset side. We also have, understandably, very high densities across all species up around Slimbridge. Okay, seabirds, you can see spatial densities tend to be more restricted to Clevedon, Somerset. Wildfowl and waders have that kind of cross-channel and slim-bridge distribution I just mentioned. If we look at the species, the SPA featured species, then several of them show pretty much constant site-specific site-specific occurrence, such as the Buick Swan. So the Buick Swan shows no evidence of spatio-temporal changes. It's got a very restricted distribution, only found at Slimbridge in all time periods studied. In contrast, Dunlin showed quite an interesting change in distribution and abundance over time. So at the start of the data set, we can see quite a few Dunlin around Newport and Somerset, and obviously up at Slimbridge. As time goes on, by 2009-2013, these Somerset Newport assemblages are almost entirely gone. Again, remember, these are based on subset data. So further analyses have to be undertaken. So these are preliminary. But Slimbridge remains. Similarly, Redshank show a smaller decrease in distribution than Dunlin, but shift away from the from the Somerset area. There are, however, consistently high densities at Newport and Slimbridge, and there's an increase in density around Portbury Wharf Nature Reserve and Sea Mills. We also used a modeling procedure to look at potential factors affecting seabird abundance, wetland bird abundance. It's important to note here that the list of factors weren't exhaustive. They were based on data availability primarily, as well as computational time. So we used a general linear modeling approach, and we looked at location, so whether the site was coastal or 1 kilometer or more inland. We looked at temperature, particularly minimum temperature, the amount of rainfall in millimeters, tide height at the time of the count, the air frost, and wind speed. We applied models to all species, as well as each species group, so waders, wildfowl, and seabirds. And then we also applied them to species of conservation concern and not of conservation concern, basically trying to tease out whether there's any intergroup or interspecific variation in responses to these different factors. And this is what we found. So, broadly speaking, site location, i.e. coastal or inland, didn't really have any impact on species presence or abundance. Increased abundances were associated with more severe weather conditions, so more rain, more frost, higher winds. Tide height was not significant, except for seabird abundance. Higher tide heights were associated with greater seabird, larger seabird counts. Quite why this is, we don't know. It's an open question. It's something we're going to try to take forward. Also, with the extreme weather, obviously, minimum temperatures, the colder the weather, the more birds there were. And from these data, it allows us to think of a few considerations. First, nature reserve designation. So the majority of SPA feature species were restricted to the kind of Newport, Somerset area and Slimbridge, with a few also dispersed around Middle Hope, Triple SI in Clevedon, and Portbury Wharf Nature Reserve, particularly in the context of Redshank. This suggests that nature reserves are playing a role in maintaining or supporting SPA feature species. That ties into the concept of habitat heterogeneity. So we might imagine that these managed sites are managed to support more species than non-managed sites would be. There's greater heterogeneity. We haven't quantified that, so it is a working hypothesis, but it seems reasonable. Also, in terms of habitat heterogeneity and nature reserve designation, there's the concept of connectivity between reserves. And again, this is something that needs further investigation, but it's likely that having a network of connected reserves, and we see this in reserve design all the time, having a network of connected reserves with suitable habitat for multiple species is likely to be more beneficial than having suitable areas very, very far apart. You'll get more birds over a wider range of area. In terms of coastal squeeze, now the Severn Estuary is subject to a large immovable flood defense system. This changes erosion and sea level rise, and hence results in a reduction in the amount of suitable land for foraging and roosting birds. Essentially, there are substantial geomorphic changes within the estuary itself. It's highly likely that some routes have become less favorable over time. In terms of weather, there's temporal variation potentially due to milder winters. Milder winters could lead to reduced movements. And it's notable that counts were increased during the particularly harsh winter of 2010-2011. However, it seems to be more likely that the increased counts result from birds short stopping or not moving further west or north due to climatic factors in the east. They may, of course, also be indicators of population decline. But finally, the results could be an artifact of survey method. Now, whether that is variance between observer, whether different observers went at different times of year. Webs are standardized, but what I mean by that is that maybe a certain surveyor took years 1 to 5 and a different surveyor took years 6 to 10, for example. There's also the consideration of illnesses, relative activity, etc. So what we're really seeing from all these considerations, many of which still require further quantification and investigation, is that it's a complex system subject to many factors. So, to conclude, we see some evidence of change within wetland bird assemblages across the Severn Estuary SPA, but it's not clear-cut. There are many factors involved. It's complex and requires further investigation. The highest densities typically were associated with managed nature reserves, but whether those reserves were coastal or inland didn't really seem to matter. However, this does suggest the need for more focused and integrated conservation and management for wetland birds, especially as distribution of birds is mobile over time. And this highlights the importance of long-term data sets, particularly those with site-specific data. You'll notice I've mentioned habitat heterogeneity and fine-scale habitat data a few times, and that's data we don't have for many of these sites. And that would be interesting to look at if possible. It also highlights the importance of identifying important roosts and long-term roosts, even outside the Webb's dataset. The next steps for us are to quantify connectivity and disturbance, and basically improve our models so we can get a better and more robust idea of exactly how these populations are changing over space and time, and what that means for conservation and management within the SPA. I'd like to thank the data providers as well as my collaborators, Jess Stone, who did an excellent job, and Richard Facey, and thank you for listening.